The linen robes feel rough against your skin as you watch a woman adjust the golden diadem that marks her as queen. Her hands shake not out of fear but out of rage, which she must swallow like bitter wine through the marble columns of the palace at Pella. You are standing in the marble corridors of a Macedonian palace, and you are about to witness one of the most terrifying wedding ceremonies in ancient history. If only they knew the truth, you would be able to see the Macedonian nobles assembling in the courtyard below, their voices rising in celebration of what they perceive to be her victory. Arsinoe, too, one of the most powerful women in antiquity, is marrying her own half-brother Tommy, whom they call Sonus Thunderbolt because of his quick and vicious ambitions, standing next to her, his arm tightly around her waist, his smile too sharp, his grip too tight. You can see the hunger in his eyes, the same hunger that motivated him to kill Seleucus and take these lands, but the wedding crown he put on her head moments ago appears to be a shackle. He assured her that her sons would be safe and that he would recognize them as heirs to his stolen throne of Macedonia. Not a wife, but the elimination of rivals. Her 3 sons from her first marriage represent threats to his rule, and despite his honeyed words, you can almost smell the blood already on Hishans. The priests chant in Greek, invoking Zeus and Hera to bless this union. How ironic, those divine siblings whose marriage the poets sing of, while the assembled nobles pretend not to see the revulsion in her eyes. This is not the first time she has been traded like a precious gem to secure an alliance. At 15, her father Tommy handed her to Lasswacus, a man old enough to be her grandfather. Now, at 40, she is currency. Once again, watch as the wine tastes like ash in her mouth while they perform the ritual toasts around them. The court celebrates, but she is already planning if she has learned anything in the 25 years since she first stepped into the treacherous waters of Hellenistic politics. It is this: survival requires more than beauty or bloodline. It requires cunning, patience, and the willingness to do whatever the gods demand, as Cyrannus raises his cup to toast their blessed union. You catch sight of her eldest son Ptolemy in the crowd. Unlike his younger brothers, he refused to come to Pella, sensing the trap that she, blinded by desperation, walked into willingly. His absence may yet save his life, while hers hangs by the thinnest of threads. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. She, Arsinoe, daughter of the great Polysoda, who carved an empire from the dying breath of Alexander's conquests, has become the very thing her enemies claim. All royal women become a pawn in the games of men, but they underestimate what a pawn can become when she reaches the other side of the board. The ceremony concludes with kisses that taste of poison and promises that ring hollow as broken pottery. Tonight, as Macedonia celebrates its new queen, she will sleep beside a man who sees her only as a stepping stone to legitimacy, who views her children as obstacles to be cleared away, but he does not know who he is truly married. He does not know that the blood of Alexander's successors runs in her veins, or that she has survived courts more treacherous than his, or that she has already begun to weave the web that will either save her or destroy them all. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering in the shadow of the pyramids, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths behind history's most powerful dynasties, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're lit. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the price of power and the women who paid it. The story of Arsinoe too begins, not with love or even desire, but with the cold mathematics of empire born around 316 B. In the marble corridors of the Tomic Palace, young Arsinoe would have learnt early on that her beauty was not her but rather belonged to the dynasty. Her father, Tool I, was one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. He had helped carry the world conqueror's body from Babylon, and then carved out his own kingdom from the chaos that followed. Her father's second wife, Brennus I, had already demonstrated that a woman could rise from relative obscurity to queenship through charm and guile. But even as Brennus whispered tales of goddesses and heroines into her daughter's ear, the reality was harsher in the world of the Diadochi. Under the marble facades and philosophical discussions, the city hummed with the ongoing tension of a dynasty still proving itself. Alexander's successor's daughters were diplomacy made flesh. Alexandria, during Arsinoe's childhood, was a city drunk on possibility. The great library was taking shape, drawing scholars from across the Mediterranean like moths to a flame. Ships from India and Arabia crowded the harbor with their holds full of silk, spices, and ivory. Greeks ruled Egypt under the Ptolemies, while Macedonians pretended to be pharaohs, and their legitimacy was challenged daily. Growing up bilingual and speaking Greek in the palace, Arsinoe learnt Egyptian from the servants who reared her. She would have witnessed the priests perform ceremonies that dated back 3,000 years, as well as the daily rituals in the temple grounds. Even as a young child, she realized that Egypt was distinct from other Hellenistic kingdoms, in that the king was not merely a ruler, but a god. Every Egyptian was aware that the earthly manifestation of divine power and the gods had their own laws regarding marriage and ancestry. The priests related tales of Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings whose union had established the cosmic order. Isis, the great mother goddess, had married her brother, Osiris, the lord of the underworld, and their love had become the basis of Egyptian religion. To the native Egyptians, sibling marriage among the gods was not scandalous. Rather, it was sacred. However, to the Greeks, it was an abomination that violated the natural order. When Arsinoe was 15 years old, her father made the choice that would shape her life. It was 3001 BCE, and the Diadochi were still engaged in conflict over the ruins of Alexander's empire. Lysimachus, the king of Thrace, needed allies against his rivals, and Ptolemy I needed to secure his eastern borders. The solution was straightforward marriage. From the Danube to the Indus, Lysimachus, a 55-year-old grizzled veteran, fought alongside Alexander Chakaz. His body bore the scars of 100 battles, including the well-known encounter with a lion that earned him the nickname Lysimachus to young Arsinoe. He must have appeared to be a figure from legend who was both terrifying and magnificent. The wedding took place in Sardis, which was formerly the capital of the Persian Empire. Imagine the scene, a large hall crowded with Greek nobles, their voices resonating off the walls, covered in gold leaf. Arsinoe was dressed in Tyrian, purple-dyed Egyptian linen robes. When Lisa put the ring on her finger with hands that had once held Alexander's stirrup, he spoke the ancient words of the Greek marriage ceremony. But his eyes were already calculating that this was not a union of hearts, but of armies. Not a romance, but a treaty written in flesh and blood. Her dark hair, crowned with a diadem that caught the light of 1,000 oil lamps, made her look beautiful in the way that teenage girls are beautiful, full of potential, promise, and cleverly concealed fear. The bride was compared to Helen of Troy and Penelope by poets during the 3-day wedding feast, and devoted musicians played flutes and harps as dancers from all over the empire entertained the gathered nobility. However, beneath the festivities was the sobering truth of what this marriage meant. Now a queen of Thrace and a participant in the lethal game of Hellenistic politics, Arsinoe was more than just a princess of Egypt. Her new husband's court was a hazardous place. Lysimachus had ruled for more than 20 years, but his kingdom was surrounded by enemies. To the north, the Thracian tribes pressed against his borders, their warriors hungry for Greek gold. To the east, the Seleucid Empire stretched from Anatolia to India, with its king Seleucus constantly probing for weakness. And to the south, the other Diadochi watched and waited for any sign of vulnerability. In this environment, Arsinoe learnt the first important lesson of her life. Survival required more than beauty or charm. It required the ability to read the currents of power, to know when to advance and when to retreat, when to speak and when to keep quiet. She watched her husband's courtiers with the intentness of a hawk studying its prey, learning to decode the subtle signs of alliance and betrayal. Within a year, she was pregnant, and the child, a son, was born in 299 B. His entrance in CE completely altered the situation. Arsinoe was no longer merely a wife, mother, or queen, but the foundation of a possible dynasty. 2 more sons, Lysimus in 297 BCE and Philip in 294 BCE, quickly followed. Each birth strengthened her position at court, each child a hostage to fortune and a weapon in the game of royal succession. But Lysimus already had an heir, his son Agatocles, born of his first marriage. As Arsinoe's sons grew from infants to toddlers, 2 young boys, the question of succession began to dominate court politics. Who would inherit the kingdom? The older son born of a commoner, or the younger sons born of a princess of Egypt? The whispers started slowly. Servants spoke in hushed tones about the Egyptian queen's ambitions. Nobles divided into factions, some supporting Agatocles, others beginning to see opportunity in the younger princes. Arsinoe found herself at the center of a web of intrigue that grew more complex. With each passing year, she began to understand the true nature of her position. She was not just a queen, she was a foreign queen, a woman whose loyalty was always suspect, whose children represented a threat to the established order. The court that had welcomed her with celebration now watched her with suspicion. Every word she spoke was analyzed for hidden meaning. Every gesture, interpreted as a sign of plotting. The pressure was enormous. Imagine being a young woman in her 20s, far from home, responsible for 3 small children, surrounded by enemies who smiled to her face and whispered poison behind her back. The weight of expectation pressed down on her like a physical force. Her father had invested Egypt's future in this marriage, and failure would mean more than personal disgrace. It would mean the weakening of the entire Ptolemaic dynasty. So Arsinoe learned to play the game. She cultivated allies among the court ladies, using her Egyptian gold to buy loyalty. She patronized philosophers and poets, creating a circle of intellectuals who praised her wisdom and beauty. she participated in religious ceremonies, showing respect for the local gods, while maintaining her own Egyptian practices, and slowly, carefully, she began to build a power base independent of her husband. The crucial moment came in 283 BCE, when Arsinoe's eldest son Tummy reached the age of 16 by Greek custom. He was now old enough to be considered for the succession. The question could no longer be avoided: who would inherit Lysimachus's kingdom? The old king was now 73, his hair white as snow, his step no longer steady. He had ruled for 39 years, longer than Alexander had lived, and the weight of those decades showed in every line of his face. But his mind remained sharp, and he understood the choice before him: support his eldest son Agatocles and risk alienating his powerful Egyptian allies, support Arsinoe's sons and risk civil war with Agatocles's supporters. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. In 283 BCE, Agatha was arrested on treason charges. The evidence against him was thin, including a few intercepted letters, suspicious meetings, and the testimony of witnesses who may have been bribed or coerced. However, in the world of Hellenistic politics, the appearance of guilt was often enough. Within days, Agatocles was executed on his father's orders, leaving the court reeling from the shock. Agatocles had been popular among the nobles, a proven military commander who had fought alongside his father in numerous campaigns. Anyone who opposed Arsinoe's sons, who were now the heirs to the throne, did so at their own risk, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Many of the old nobles who had served Lysimachus since the beginning now viewed Arsinoe as a foreign sorceress who had corrupted their king. The whispers became more venomous and louder, and she was referred to as a second Medea, a woman who would destroy everything she touched in her quest for power. The kingdom's external enemies sensed weakness as a result of Agatocles' death, which caused divisions that would never be fully reconciled. Seleucus, knowing that the kingdom's concentration was inward on its own divisions, in 281 BC, pirates ravaged the coastal cities as the last of Alexander's original bodyguards, started to advance against Lysimachus' eastern lands. The Thracian tribes pressed harder against the northern boundaries. CE. The crisis reached a climax when Seleucus invaded Anatolia with a large army, claiming to have avenged the death of Agatocles. Lysimachus, despite his advanced siege, he took the field one last time at the Battle of Corupedium. The battle was a disaster for Lysimachus, as his army, weakened by years of internal strife, crumbled under the Seleucid assault, and the old king himself fell in the fighting, his body pierced by a dozen spears. With his death, the kingdom of Thrace collapsed like a house built on sand. Aspiring generals and vindictive nobles were tearing away the country her husband had established around her. Arsinoe had not endured 20 years of court intrigue by remaining passive, and even as the news of her husband's death reached her, she was already preparing her next move. She gathered her most devoted supporters, secured what treasure she could carry, and got ready to flee as Seleucus advanced on the capital. The woman who had once been carried to Sardis in a bridal litter now faced the prospect of fleeing for her life. The irony was bitter. She had played the game of power as well as any man, had sacrificed her stepson to secure her children's future, and had endured decades of suspicion and hatred. And no, in the moment of crisis, she found herself with no choice but to run. The journey to safety was harrowing. Picture a royal caravan moving through the night, torches flickering in the darkness. The sound of horses' hooves muffled by the Arsinoe road with her 3 sons, Pot, now 17, Lysimachus, 15, and Philip, 12. They were no longer princes, butrifuges, their royal robes exchanged for the rough clothes, aftravellers. Behind them, the kingdom burnt. Seleucus had taken the capital, and his soldiers were methodically hunting down anyone connected to the old regime. Arsinoe's supporters were being executed or enslaved. The cities that had once celebrated her arrival now opened their gates to Arsinoes. But Cluse himself would not live to enjoy his victory even as Arsinoe fled westward. Another drama was unfolding. Tommy Coronis, her half-brother, the son of her father's first marriage, had been living in exile at Koku's court. The old king had promised to help him regain his birthright and install him as ruler of Macedonia. But Coronis was impatient and ambitious and utterly ruthless. At the very moment of triumph, as Seleucus prepared to cross into Europe, the last of Alexander's original comrades was killed by a man who was young enough to be his grandson after Seraphisan struck and killed his host and patron, taking the army and the crown of Macedonia for himself. As she sought refuge in a harbor town on the coast of Ion, Arsinoe received the news that her half-brother, the man who had been passed over for the succession in Egypt and who had spent decades nursing his grievances in foreign courts, was now king of Macedonia, and he was offering her a marriage. The proposal was brought to her by a messenger who spoke in sweet words about reconciliation and family unity, promising that Coronis would recognize her sons as his heirs and give them the kingdom that Lysimachus had lost. He talked about love and destiny and the necessity for the Ptolemaic bloodline to rule in Macedonia as it did in Egypt. Arsinoe had listened to these promises from Lysimachus numerous times before, and she was aware of the weight of royal promises and how easily they could be forgotten when convenience demanded. But she also knew that she had no other option. Her decision to accept Coronis' proposal was the most difficult of her life. She was not a naive girl this time, but a 40-year-old woman who had witnessed the full horror of what men could do when power was at stake. She knew that marrying her half-brother was a desperate gamble, and she was walking into a trap with her eyes wide open, but she had no choice but to accept, risking everything in the hopes that blood might mean something, that family ties might prove stronger than political calculation, as she prepared to depart for Macedonia. In order to ensure that at least one of her children would live to continue the family line in the event of calamity, Arsinoe took one last decision. She dispatched her oldest son, Tommy, to the court of a distant ally. This was a mother's wisdom born of painful experience and desperate love. Coronis spared no expense in proving his legitimacy. But beneath the gold and purple of the music and dancing, the cold reality of political necessity was revealed. The wedding took place in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia, in the shadow of the palace where Alexander had been raised. As the priests carried out the ancient rites, Arsinoe stood next to her half-brother. They were the offspring of the same father, but different mothers. And the first's numerous marriages were not only acceptable, but also revered in Egyptian tradition, reflecting the divine unions that upheld cosmic order. However, there was something unsettling about this match that spoke of desperation rather than fate to the Greeks. The honeymoon was counted in hours on the night of their marriage, Although the wedding feast lasted for 3 days, Sonus came clean and said that he had married Arsinoe not out of love or even a political partnership, but rather to remove the threat her boys posed. With her safely under his control, he could take care of her kids whenever he wanted. The treachery was severe and quick. The palace apartments where Arsinoe's 2 younger sons were staying were encircled by Coronis warriors. Her grief was a luxury she could not afford, and even as her sons' bodies were being dragged away, she was making plans for her escape. Lascus and Philip, ages 15 and 12, were dragged from their beds and murdered in front of their mother's eyes. Their blood stained the marble floors of the palace where Alexander had once played as a child. Arsinoe's screams reverberated through the halls of Pella, a sound that would haunt the palace for generations. As guards watched her every move and servants reported her every word, Arsinoe started to plan her own survival. The escape was worthy of a novel, and she used devoted servants and the underground network of slaves and freedmen that existed in every palace to slip away from Pella. In the dead of night, the woman who had survived 2 decades of court intrigue was not about to let this betrayal be her end. She had learnt from her father's example, who had escaped from impossible situations by being faster and more ruthless than his enemies. She was disguised as a servant, her royal robes exchanged for a fool, her jeweled diadem replaced by a simple headscarf behind her. She left Arsinoe, a slave woman who bore a passing resemblance to Thuquin, who would buy precious hours before the deception was discovered. The journey to safety was a nightmare of narrow escapes and hidden dangers. Sounds of soldiers were everywhere, searching for the woman who had humiliated their king by escaping his trap. Arsinoe moved through thigh shadows, helped by a network of supporters who risked their lives to shelter her. Some were motivated by loyalty, others by gold, but all understood that they were participants in a drama that would be remembered for centuries. Her destination was the island of Samothrace, a sacred place where the ancient mystery religions offered sanctuary to those who sought it. The island's temples were protected by customs older than the Greek cities, older than the Macedonian kingdom. Even Coronis would not dare violate the sacred precinct of the great gods. As her ship approached the rocky shores of Samothrace, Arsinoe was not a woman to be defeated by tragedy. Even as she mourned for her lost children, she was already making plans for her next move. She had been married 3 times, had 3 sons, ruled as queen of 2 kingdoms, and was now a refugee, reliant on the protection of ancient laws and the charity of priests. 2 of her sons had been killed by her own half-brother, and the 3rd was in exile with an uncertain future. Her youngest brother, Ptolemy, now ruled Egypt as pharaoh. If she could reach Alexandria, if she could convince him to take Haran, she might yet find a way to survive. The journey from Samothrace to Alexandria was fraught with danger. Coronis ships patrolled the northern Argin, while pirates infested the southern waters. But Arsinoe had learned to be resourceful and to use every advantage available to her. She traveled in disguise, sometimes as a merchant's wife, sometimes as a pilgrim seeking religious instruction or beauty. Once her greatest asset was now hidden beneath rough clothes and careful makeup. When she finally reached the harbor of Alexandria, the city of her birth, she must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. This washam but it was also the place where her exile had begun 40 years earlier. The palace where she had played as a child was now ruled by a brother. She barely knew a man who had been an infant when she was married to Lama Susi. Philadelphia was 36 years old, a scholar and administrator who had inherited his father's kingdom but not his military genius. Egypt was prosperous under his rule. Its trade route secure, its temples magnificent, but the pharaoh himself was a cautious man, unwilling to take the risks that had made his father great. After decades apart and mutual mistrust, the brother and sister's reunion was unpleasant. Arsinoe had changed from a young princess who had fled Alexandria in a bridal litter to a woman who was longing for a second chance and had been hardened by tragedy and treachery. She was a sister who could be a useful ally or a rival who could undermine his authority. Thus, Tomley too saw both an opportunity and a threat in her. The discussions were complex. Arsinoe needed a place to call home, but she also needed a position that matched her background and goals. She could not simply retire to a comfortably sill and could not accept the life of a dependent relative. She had been a queen amateur and a player in the great game offer. She would not be content to fade into obscurity. The solution, when it came, was as shocking as it was brilliant. Tommy, too, was married to Arsinoe I, a woman who had given him children but who lacked the political acumen to be a true partner in rule. If he were to divorce his wife and marry his sister, he would gain not just a queen, but a co-ruler, someone who understood the complexities of dynastic politics as few others did. The idea of sibling marriage was not new to Egypt for 3,000 years. The pharaohs had occasionally married their sisters, following the example of the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris, the divine couple who ruled the underworld, were brother and sister. Their union was not seen as incestuous, but as sacred, a reflection of the cosmic order that kept the universe in balance. But the Ptolemies were Greek, and to the Greeks, sibling marriage was an abomination. It violated the natural order, offended the gods, and threatened the stability of society. No Ptolemaic ruler had ever married a full sibling, though they had occasionally married half-siblings or cousins. Breaking this taboo was not a hasty decision. The announcement of the engagement sent shockwaves through the Greek world, with poets and philosophers debating the morality of sibling marriage and politicians calculating the implications for their own kingdoms. However, Ptolemy too also recognized the benefits of marrying Arsinoe, demonstrating that the Ptolemies were not just Greek kings ruling Egypt, but true pharaohs inheriting the most ancient traditions. He also understood that he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, and that the wedding itself, was a magnificent affair intended to emphasize the divine nature of the union. The ceremony took place in the great temple of Buta in Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, where pharaohs had been crowned for millennia. The rituals were Egyptian rather than Greek, emphasizing the sacred nature of the marriage and the divine status of the couple. Some saw it as evidence of Egyptian decadence, proving that Ptolemies had been corrupted by their foreign subjects. Others recognized it as a brilliant piece of propaganda, claiming legitimacy that no other Hellenistic dynasty could match. Arsinoe, who is now 41, stood next to her brother, who is 26 years old, as the high priest wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, a symbol of ferocious authority, worn by monarchs from the time of Menes. She performed the ancient ceremonies. Her brother was dressed like a pharaoh, complete with crook and flail. which represented his position as his people's shepherd. The hymns sung that day were incalculably old. They had been written long before the pyramids were constructed, and they described the union of earth and sky, between order and chaos, and the declaration that the royal couple was no longer just a human couple, but had become gods, deserving of adoration. The Greek inhabitants of Alexandria were scandalous, but they were also. They had never seen anything like the ceremony, and had never witnessed the full pageantry of any sea religion. The Tummies had always maintained a careful balance between their Greek and Egyptian identities, but now they were declaring themselves fully Egyptian, fully ethnic. The marriage transformed both partners. Tommy, too, became Tommy Philadelphia, the brother-lover, a title that was both description and boast. Arsinoe became Arsinoe Philadelphia, the sister-wife who shared in the divine authority of the pharaoh. Together they weareth Theo Philadelphia, the sibling-loving gods who ruled Egypt as Isis and Osiris ruled the underworld. But the transformation was more than ceremonial. Arsinoe brought to the marriage decades of experience in the deadly game of Hellenistic harlots. She had survived the courts of Lysimachus and Cyrenius, had seen kingdoms rise and fall, had learned the art of survival in a world where weakness meant death. Now, for the first time in her life, she was in a position to use that knowledge without fear. The new queen threw herself into the work of government with an energy that amazed her subjects. She accompanied Polly on his tours of the kingdom, helping to settle disputes and manage the complex relationships between the various ethnic groups that made up Egypt's population. She patronized the arts and sciences, continuing the tradition of intellectual patronage that had made Alexandria the center of learning in the ancient world. But her greatest contribution was in the realm of foreign policy. The had to skillfully and strategically negotiate these perilous waters as the Romans were extending their influence in the western Mediterranean and the Parthians were advancing on the eastern borders of the Seleucid Empire. The Hellenistic world was more dangerous than ever as new powers emerged to challenge the status quo. The royal couple, who were depicted receiving offerings from the populace and blessing the land with their divine presence, while upholding cosmic order through their sacred union, started to appear on coins and monuments as gods after Arsinoe realized the value of using divine imagery to project power. This policy was effective for Egypt's subjects. Both Greeks and Egyptians started to view their rulers as legitimate pharaohs who were the heirs of a heritage that dated back to the beginning of civilization. This was made possible by the divine union that had given the Ptolemies something that no other Hellenistic dynasty possessed, a claim to authority that was both political and religious, both Greek and Egyptian, but the personal cost was enormous. Arsinoe had sacrificed everything, her first marriage, her children, her youth, to reach this position. She had endured decades of exile and betrayal, had watched her sons murdered before. Her eyes had fled for her life across the Mediterranean. Now, in the twilight of her life, she had achieved the ultimate prize, a share in divine authority, a place among the gods themselves. The marriage produced no children, but it didn't need to. Tommy, too, already had heirs from his first marriage, and Arsinoe was now past childbearing age. What mattered was not biological reproduction, but political and religious transformation. The Tummies had become something new, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human authority as Arsinoe stood In the palace of Alexandria, wearing the crown of the pharaohs, she must have reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been a pawn in her father's diplomatic games, the most famous of all Ptolemaic queens. Cleopatra married 2 of her brothers in succession and used the prestige of her divine ancestry to challenge Rome itself. However, that is a story for another time. For now, as we watch Arsinoe in her moment of triumph, she was a trophy wife to an aging king, a victim of her half-brother's murderous ambition, and a woman who used every tool at her disposal, be it beauty, intelligence, ruthlessness, or sheer will, to survive and ultimately triumph. The tradition she established would outlast her by centuries. We must be amazed at the price she paid for power and the unwavering will that saw her through decades of suffering before receiving this final validation. From childhood to middle age, she was used as a tool of dynastic policy twice, and was forced into incest, but she ultimately turned that suffering into strength and victimization into victory. As the sun set over the Nile, casting long shadows across the palace gardens, the woman who had Ansikhabu in a Macedonian palace as her children were murdered now stood as a goddess in the land of the pharaohs. Her authority was unquestioned, and her legacy was secure. She had paid the ultimate price for power, but she had also earned the ultimate reward: immortality. Not only in the memory of historians, but also in the religious traditions of the people she ruled. Arsinoe must have felt a deep satisfaction that she had survived the unsurvivable, had triumphed over impossibles, and had transformed herself from victim to goddess. The girl who had been sold into marriage at 15 had become the woman who redefined what it meant to be atomic queen. The bloodline would continue, preserved not through her own children, but through the institution she had created. The practice of royal incest, once shocking and unprecedented, would become the defining characteristic of the Ptolemaic dynasty and future. Queens would look back to her as the founder of their traditions, the woman who had shown them that survival was possible even in the most desperate circumstances. But theatrable, heartbreakest, would never be forgotten. Every future marriage would carry the echo of her sacrifice. Every divine ceremony would remember the price she paid. She had saved the dynasty, but she had lost herself in the process, and had become a symbol rather than a person, a goddess rather than a woman. As night fell over Alexandria, the city settled into the rhythm that would define it for the next 3 centuries. In the palace, the divine couple performed their sacred duties, maintaining the cosmic order through their union. In the temples, priests offered prayers for the health and prosperity of the Thoi. The tragic irony was complete. In her attempt to preserve her humanity through the protection of her children, she had been forced to sacrifice her humanity in order to become a god. In her struggle to remain a mother, she had been forced to become a myth. The tradition Arsinoe had established would outlive her, but it would never escape the blood that had watered its roots. In the streets of Philadelphia, merchants, scholars, farmers, and fishermen went about their lives under the protection of gods who had once been human. Meanwhile, somewhere in the shadows of memory, the ghosts of 2 murdered boys played in the gardens of their childhood, their laughter reverberating across the centuries like a reminder of the price that power always demands. The tale was far from over. The Ptolemaic dynasty would go on for another 2.5 centuries, producing rulers who would go down in history as some of the most brilliant and depraved. But they would all trace their traditions back to this woman and this horrific and necessary transformation of victim into goddess. The years that followed the divine marriage were a study in the intricate dance between power and its cost. The royal couple's first major test came in 274 BCE, when the Seleucid Empire, still reeling from the chaos following Seleucus's murder, was being torn apart by rival claims to the throne. Antiochus I, the legitimate heir, found himself challenged by pretenders and rebellious governors who saw opportunity in the empire's weakness for Egypt. This presented both danger and opportunity, offering the chance to reclaim territories lost to Seleucus, but also the risk of being dragged into an expensive war. Arsinoe was really helpful during these discussions. When Tommy, too, wavered between caution and aggression, she gave the decisive counsel that would shape Egypt's strategy for decades to come. Now, as they stood on the palace balcony overlooking Alexandria's harbor, watching fewer ships prepare for departure, she told her brother husband that her experience with the courts of both Lysimachus and Cyrenius had taught her to read the subtle currents of interdynastic politics. She understood how ambitious generals thought, how they calculated risk and reward, and how they could be manipulated or defeated. Antiochus is not strong. His dominion fell apart, but his weakness was only momentary. While he is bleeding from a dozen wounds, she said, give him time and he will consolidate his power strike. Her words were weighed down by sad experience, as she had witnessed what happened to those who hesitated when fortune delivered her gifts and waited too long. The lesson was clear. In the world of Hellenistic politics, timing was everything. Lysimachus had hesitated before dealing with Agatha, and that hesitation had cost him everything. Cyrenius had struck quickly when he killed Seleucus, but he had then become complacent and allowed his enemies to organize against him. The war that followed validated her counsel, and Egyptian forces swept through Palestine and southern Syria, reclaiming territories that had been lost for decades. Cities that had groaned under sordid taxation welcomed the Ptolemaic armies as liberators. Arsinoe herself accompanied some of these campaigns, her presence serving to both inspire the troops and ensure that the victories were properly consolidated. However, Arsinoe excelled in more than just military strategy. She understood something that many of her contemporaries missed: the significance of narrative in controlling how power was perceived and remembered under her influence. Poets like Theocritus were commissioned to compose verses comparing the royal couple to Zeus and Hera, highlighting the divine nature of their union while making it acceptable to Greek sensibilities. This resulted in the royal court becoming a hub of artistic and literary production, unlike anything seen since Pericles' time in Athens. Even as Zeus, the king of the immortals, loves Hera, his sister wife, wrote Theocritus, so does Tommy love his bride. The comparison was deliberate and calculated. If the king of the gods could marry his sister, then surely mortal pharaohs could do the same. But Arsinoe was careful to balance Greek and Egyptian sensibilities in the temples along the Nile. She and Tommy were depicted as Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings whose union maintained cosmic order. The hieroglyphic inscriptions spoke of their marriage in terms that had been sacred for millennia, emphasizing continuity with the pharaonic past rather than innovation or foreign-influence. The queen's influence extended into every aspect of court life. She reformed the royal household establishing new ceremonies and protocols that emphasized the divine status of the ruling couple she patronized there at library, ensuring that scholars from across the Mediterranean came to Alexandria to study and teach. She oversaw the construction of magnificent temples and public buildings that proclaimed Ptolemaic power to both subjects and foreign visitors. Perhaps, most importantly, she began the process of integrating her stepchildren, Poly II's children from his first marriage, into the new order. The crown prince who would become Ptolemy III was only a child when his father divorced his mother to marry Arsinoe, but the new queen was careful to show him honor and affection, understanding that her own security depended on his eventual loyalty. "You are the future of this dynasty," she told the young prince during one of their private conversations. "Your father and I are but guardians of the throne until you are ready to claim it. Remember that power is not inherited, it is earned day by day, decision by decision. The gods may have made you a prince, but only your own actions can make you a king." These were lessons born of her own bitter experience. She had seen too many royal children grow up believing that their birth entitled them to rule, only to discover that the world cared nothing for their bloodline if they lacked the strength to defend it. The boy who would become Ptolemy III absorbed these teachings, and they would serve him well when his time came to rule. As the years passed, Arsinoe found herself taking on roles that had traditionally been reserved for men. She attended meetings of the royal council, where her voice carried as much weight as any general or administrator. She received foreign ambassadors, her knowledge of languages and customs proving invaluable in negotiations. She even took part in religious ceremonies traditionally performed only by Thefario, sharing in the sacred duties that maintained Egypt's relationship with the gods. The transformation was remarkable. Perhaps the most important aspect of Arsinoe's reign was the precedent she set for future TMIC queens. Before her marriage to Ptolemy II, the woman who had once been a pawn in her father's diplomatic games had become a player of equal rank to any ruler in the Mediterranean world. Foreign kings sought her favor, knowing that her influence with Ptolemy II was absolute, and scholars dedicated their works to her, recognizing her as a patron worthy of immortal verse. The people of Egypt worshipped her as a goddess, believing that her divine blessing ensured the fertility of their fields and the prosperity of their cities. In the Hellenistic era, royal women were valued mostly as mothers and diplomatic assets. Although they might have significant influence behind the scenes, they hardly ever held official positions of authority or titles. All of that was altered by Arsinoe, who established the model for what academics would later refer to as Ptolemaic queenship, a style of female governance that fused Hellenistic notions of royal authority with traditional Egyptian ideas of divine kingship. Queens like Cleopatra II would build upon the foundation she established, but they would always credit her as the source of their power. The irony was not lost on those who were familiar with her story. The woman who had been forced into incestuous marriages as a victim of male political calculations had transformed those very marriages into sources of unprecedented femilutherity. She had taken the chains that bound her and forged them into a crown. As Arsinoe entered her 50s, she began to contemplate her legacy. She had no children of her own to carry on her bloodline, but she had created something perhaps more lasting, an institution, a way of being queen that would endure long after her death. The practice of sibling marriage that had begun with her union tome would become the defining characteristic of the Ptolemaic dynasty, setting them apart from all other Hellenistic rulers. She established a cult in her own honor, something unprecedented for a living queen. Temples were built where she was worshipped as a goddess, and festivals were instituted to celebrate her divine marriage. Priesthoods were created to maintain her sacred rites. These were not merely expressions of royal vanity. They were carefully calculated moves to ensure that her innovations would survive her death. The end came in 270 B. The cause of Arsinoe's death at the age of 46 CE is unknown. It could have been poisoning, disease, or just the cumulative effects of a life filled with extreme stress and peril. Her funeral was a pharaoh-worthy spectacle, with representatives from all over the Mediterranean globe traveling for days to pay their respects. What matters is not how she passed away, but rather what she accomplished in life. Priests conducted ceremonies in several languages, poets chanted poems in her honor, and Egyptians lamented the passing of their holy queen. Yet even death could not lessen her impact. She was officially deified as Arsinoe Philodelos, the brother-loving goddess, and her worship was incorporated into Egypt's state religion. Temples throughout the kingdom maintained her sacred fires, and her image appeared on coins and monuments for centuries to come. More importantly, the tradition she had established continued, with future PMIC rulers following her example and marrying their siblings to maintain the divine character of their authority. This practice became so essential that each successive generation of sibling marriages was a tribute to Harmamore, a recognition that she had found the key to legitimacy in a world that respected The tragic irony of her story was complete. The woman who had been victimized by the practice of dynastic marriage had transformed that same practice into a source of unprecedented female authority. She had been forced into incest by the political calculations of men, but she had made incest into a tool for transcending the limitations that those same men had tried to impose on her. As the centuries passed and the Ptolemaic dynasty eventually fell to Roman conquest, historians would debate the morality and wisdom of that tradition. Arsinoe had established some would condemn the practice of sibling marriage as a corruption of natural law, a sign of decadence that inevitably led to the dynasty's downfall. Others would recognize it as a brilliant adaptation to the unique circumstances of Hellenistic Egypt, a way of maintaining legitimacy in a world of competing claims and divided loyalties. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Arsinoe too came from an unexpected source. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and began his affair with Cleopatra, he was amazed by the young queen's confidence and authority. How does she carry herself with such divine assurance? He allegedly asked one of his advisors, and the response was straightforward. She was the successor to a tradition that dated back over 3 centuries to a lady who had turned misery into strength, victimization into triumph, and chains into crowns. Cleopatra ruled as she did because Arsinoe II had shown her how to do it, had created the template for Ptolemaic queenship that made such authority possible in the end. That may be the most remarkable aspect of Arsinoe's story. She began as a pawn in other people's games, a victim of forces beyond her control, but through intelligence, determination, and an almost superhuman capacity for survival. She transformed herself into something unprecedented in the ancient world, a woman who ruled, not just through marriage or motherhood, but through her own merit and authority. The cost had been enormous. She had sacrificed her children, her youth, her peace of mind, and ultimately her humanity to achieve this transformation she had been forced to become. A goddess, because being merely human was not enough to ensure survival in the world. She inhabited, but the achievement was equally enormous. She had created a new model of female power, had shown that even in the most patriarchal of societies, a woman of sufficient determination could transcend the limitations imposed on her gender. She had proven that victimization need not be permanent, that even the most desperate circumstances could be transformed into opportunities for greatness. As the sun set over the Nile on the day of her funeral, casting long shadows across the temples where she would be worshipped for centuries to come, the Moires dispersed to their homes, carrying with them the memory of a queen unlike any other. She had been the woman forced into incest by her own father's political ambitions, but she had also been the woman who transformed those very ambitions into a source of power that would echo through the ages, the bloodline she had sought so desperately to preserve through her own children lived on instead through the institution she had created. Every future Talic queen who married her brother, every ceremony that proclaimed the divine nature of royal incest, every coin that bore the image of sibling rulers, all were monuments to her memory, testaments to the price she had paid and the victory she had won in death as in life. Arsinoe to Philadelphia remained what she had always been, a woman who refused to accept the limitations others sought to impose on her, who transformed every chain into a crown, every defeat into a stepping stone to greater power. She had been the victim who became the goddess, the pawn who became the queen, the woman who showed the world that even incest, the ultimate symbol of powerlessness and exploitation, could be transformed into a source of strength. Her story was over, but her legacy would endure until the last Potmic pharaoh fell to Roman swords, and the dynasty she had helped create finally passed into history. Even then, her influence would survive in the memories of historians and the imagination of poets, a reminder that human beings are capable of transforming even the most horrific circumstances into sources of meaning, purpose, and power. The goddess who ultimately redefined what it meant to be queen was the queen who had been forced into incest by her own father. Perhaps that was enough victory. Thank you for joining Secret Historian on this extraordinary journey into the warnings left behind by those who vanished. If you believe the past still holds wisdom, if you know deep down that history was never asleep, only waiting, subscribe now to Secret Historian.